The Peaceful Pines Community Center was packed. Karen had never seen such attendance, not even when she proposed the controversial ban on flamingo lawn ornaments. She stood at the podium, freshly coiffed and dressed in a power suit, trying to ignore the hushed giggles and sidelong glances. "Order, I'll have order." Karen rapped her gavel 3 times. First agenda item: the dangerous condition of community drainage infrastructure. From the back row, Dave Wilson raised his hand. Karen pointedly ignored him. "Furthermore, I've noticed an alarming trend of lawn height violations." "Point of order," Dave called out without being recognized. "Before we discuss drainage ditches or grass height, the community bylaws require us to address any motion put forward by 10 or more residents." Karen's smile froze. "There are no such motions on the agenda." Dave stood, holding a document. "Actually, we have a petition signed by 63 residents calling for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership." The room erupted. Karen's gavel pounding was lost in the noise as neighbors she'd fined and harassed over the years suddenly found their voices. Richard, who should have been supporting her, was staring at his shoes. "This is procedurally improper." Karen's voice rose to a pitch that made the audio system squeal. "You can't just." Section 8, Article 4 of the bylaws, Dave continued, unflappable. He'd been a corporate attorney before retirement, a fact Karen had conveniently forgotten. "The petition has been properly filed. We move to vote immediately." What followed was the most humiliating 30 minutes of Karen's life. Neighbor after neighbor approached the microphone with stories. The time she'd fined the Johnsons $500 for having a birthday balloon tied to their mailbox. How she demanded Mrs. Abernathy repaint her entire house because the shade of beige was sandstone instead of the approved desert sand. The cease and desist letter to the 3rd-grade twins who'd set up a lemonade stand. When the votes were tallied, Karen had lost her position by a margin that couldn't even charitably be called close. 61-3, with 2 abstentions. The 3 supporters included herself, her sister-in-law, and, surprisingly, Gladys Martins, who explained she didn't believe in kicking someone when they're down, even if they deserved it. Karen sat in stunned silence as Dave was unanimously elected the new HOA president. His first act? Establishing a 3-person review panel for all violation notices and reducing the rulebook from 147 pages to a reasonable 15. Meeting adjourned, Dave announced, his gavel tap gentle compared to Karen's authoritarian pounding. As people filed out, some avoiding her eyes, others giving her looks that mixed pity with satisfaction, Karen remained seated. Richard touched her shoulder. "Maybe it's for the best, honey. You've been so stressed lately." Karen shrugged him off. "They've made a terrible mistake. This neighborhood will fall apart without proper oversight." But beneath her indignation, a tiny, unfamiliar voice whispered a different truth. Perhaps she had gone too far. Perhaps there was another way to be. Karen Worthington left the community center no longer president of anything, her identity stripped away, with no idea who she was supposed to be now. Karen Worthington shrieked as her gutsy heel snapped, sending her tumbling face first into the muddy drainage ditch that separated Sycamore Lane from Oakwood Drive. The clipboard she'd been clutching, filled with violation notices for her neighbors, sailed through the air, papers scattering like confetti across the pristine lawn she'd been about to cite for being 1/4 inch too tall. "This is unacceptable," she sputtered, spitting mud and wiping furiously at her ruined silk blouse. "This ditch is a hazard. The HOA will hear about this immediately." The irony was lost on Karen that she, as president of the Peaceful Pines Homeowners Association, was essentially threatening herself. She'd spent the morning doing what she did every Tuesday, patrolling the neighborhood with a measuring tape and her trusty clipboard, documenting every violation of the 147-page rulebook she'd helped expand over her 4-year reign. From her mud-soaked position, Karen spotted Gladys Martins peering from behind her polka-dotted curtains. The older woman quickly retreated, but not before Karen caught her smile. A humiliating, burning rage filled Karen's chest. She'd issued Gladys 3 warnings last month alone. Bird feeders were expressly prohibited in Section 34, Paragraph 7, Subclause C. Taking pictures for the neighborhood newsletter, ladies? Karen shouted, her voice cracking. I hope you get my good side. Karen struggled to her feet, the suction of the mud making disgusting squelching noises as she extracted herself. Her once blonde bob now resembled a muddy mop, and her white pants were beyond salvation. As she limped home, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the sidewalk, a violation of Ordinance 72.5, Karen mentally composed the emergency meeting agenda: drainage ditch maintenance, increased fines for lawn care negligence, and a new rule prohibiting photography of HOA officials without prior written consent. The Peaceful Pines community chat app pinged relentlessly. Someone, probably that troublemaker Dave Wilson from Oak Street, had already shared footage of her fall. The video had 47 likes and counting, including one from her husband, Richard. By the time Karen reached her colonial revival home, the only style permitted in the eastern section of the development, she'd moved beyond embarrassment into strategic thinking. The residents thought this was funny. Fine. They'd see who'd be laughing when she instituted mandatory Saturday community service for all homeowners. As she showered away the mud, Karen rehearsed her speech for the emergency meeting she'd call that evening. They needed to understand, rules existed for a reason. Without her vigilance, Peaceful Pines would descend into chaos. Mismatched mailboxes, unauthorized garden gnomes, children's toys visible from the street. The horror. Karen wrapped herself in her monogrammed bathrobe and poured a glass of Chardonnay. Despite it being only 10:30 am, she pulled out her laptop and began typing a notice that would strike fear into the hearts of her neighbors. Emergency HOA meeting. Tonight 7 p.m. Attendance mandatory. Fines for ABS-ENC will be doubled. As she hit send, Karen didn't realize that this meeting would mark the beginning of the end of her reign, or that the muddy ditch she'd fallen into was nothing compared to the hole she was about to dig for herself. 6 months after her literal fall from grace, Karen Worthington stood beside the newly constructed footbridge spanning the drainage ditch between Sycamore Lane and Oakwood Drive. A small plaque affixed to the handrail read, Worthington Crossing. Building connections. It had been Dave's idea, a gesture Karen still didn't quite know how to process. Speech time, Dave said, handing Karen a pair of ceremonial scissors for the ribbon cutting. A crowd had gathered, not as large as the one that had voted her out, but substantial nonetheless. Karen looked at the faces before her, some friendly, others still wary. She took a deep breath. 6 months ago, I fell into this ditch, she began, drawing a few chuckles. I was angry about it. I wanted to blame someone, find someone, make rules so it would never happen again. She paused, searching for the right words. I thought I was protecting our community, but somewhere along the way, I confused control with care. She gestured to the bridge. This is what actual community looks like, identifying a problem and working together on a solution that helps everyone. I'm still learning this approach. After the ceremony, Karen found herself surrounded by neighbors who, if not completely warm, were at least civil. The Rodriguez children were selling lemonade from a stand decorated with balloons, multiple violations under her old regime, and Karen bought a cup, overtipping considerably. Later, she walked with ladies toward the community garden where Karen now volunteered 3 days a week. The zucchini are coming in nicely, Gladys remarked. Your idea to add the irrigation system made a huge difference. Karen nodded, feeling a now familiar sense of quiet satisfaction. Her organizational skills and attention to detail, once weaponized through HOA regulations, had found more constructive outlets. The garden thrived, and the newsletter she now edited was more about celebrating community achievements than listing violations. There's an opening on the Bridge Maintenance Committee, Gladys mentioned casually. Just 1 meeting a month. Dave thought you might be interested. Karen tensed slightly. She'd deliberately stayed away from anything resembling HOA involvement. I don't think people want me making rules again. It's not about making rules, Gladys said gently. It's about contributing your strengths without being a dictator. Karen supplied with a wry smile. Your words, not mine, Gladys laughed. As they reached the garden, Karen noticed Mr. Thompson struggling to stake tomato plants. The same Mr. Thompson whose son's car she tried to have towed multiple times. "Need a hand?" she called, surprised at her own initiative. He looked up, hesitant, then nodded. Together they worked in companionable silence until the tomatoes stood properly supported. "Thanks," he said finally. "Your system's better than what I was doing." "Your son's car," Karen blurted suddenly. "I was unreasonable about it. I'm sorry." Mr. Thompson studied her for a moment. "He got it running properly last month. Kid's got a talent for mechanics." That's wonderful," Karen replied, meaning it. Walking home that evening, Karen took the long route that crossed her namesake bridge. She stopped midway, looking down at the ditch that had quite literally tripped her into a new life. She wasn't entirely reformed. Just yesterday she'd caught herself mentally measuring the height of that Abernethy's grass. Old habits died hard, but for every step backward, she was making two forward. The neighborhood still had standards, but they were enforced with flexibility and compassion rather than Karen's former iron fist. As she continued home, Karen noticed a lawn flamingo peeking from behind the Wilson's hydrangea bush, arguably a violation of the revised aesthetic guidelines, though now classified as a recommendation rather than a requirement. Karen smiled, shook her head, and kept walking. Some battles weren't worth fighting. Some rules were meant to bend, and sometimes, just sometimes, a fall into a ditch could be the first step on a better path. But as she reached her driveway, Karen couldn't help noticing the Andersons' trash bins, left at the curb a full day after collection. Her eye twitched slightly as she reached for her phone. Not to document the violation, but to send a friendly reminder text. Baby steps, she told herself. Baby steps. 3 weeks after what neighbors had taken to calling the coop, Karen was still adjusting to civilian life. Without her morning violation patrols, she found herself with hours of unfilled time. Richard had suggested hobbies, gardening, perhaps, or book club, but Karen had dismissed these as frivolous. Instead, she monitored the neighborhood from her bay window, documenting every infraction in a leather-bound journal. The Martinez family installed unapproved solar panels. The Wilsons painted their front door red, RED, without a color review. The Thompsons' teenage son started parking his rusted Honda on the street instead of in the garage where unsightly vehicles belonged. And yet, oddly, Peaceful Pines hadn't descended into chaos. In fact, Karen reluctantly admitted to herself, the neighborhood seemed more vibrant. Children played outside more often. People lingered to chat during evening walks. The spring block party, organized by a committee that no longer included Karen, had record attendance. On a particularly beautiful May morning, Karen was startled by a knock at her door. She opened it to find Gladys Martinez holding a flowering plant. "Thought you might like this for your garden," Gladys said. "It's a hydrangea." Karen accepted the pot awkwardly. "You know, your bird feeders are still against regulation." Gladys chuckled. "The regulations changed last week. Small wildlife accommodations are now permitted." She hesitated, then added, "The garden committee meets Thursdays at 4. We could use someone with your attention to detail." Before Karen could respond, she noticed a small crowd gathering at the drainage ditch where she'd fallen. Dave Wilson was there with several residents and what appeared to be a contractor. "What's happening over there?" Karen demanded. "They're installing a footbridge," Gladys explained. "Dave said it was actually a good idea, making that crossing safer. He just went about it differently than you would have." Karen's first instinct was indignation. They were implementing one of her ideas. But it faded quickly into something more complex. Had she mentioned a bridge in her rambling emergency meeting agenda? She couldn't remember. "Would you like to come see?" Gladys asked. "They're taking suggestions on design." Something inside Karen resisted. Go join the very people who had humiliated her. But a stronger, newer feeling pushed back. Curiosity. Maybe even loneliness. "I suppose I could give them some input," Karen said stiffly. "Proper infrastructure standards are important." As they walked toward the gathering, Karen became uncomfortably aware of her neighbors' reactions. Conversations pausing, smiles fading. She almost turned back, but Gladys gently guided her forward. Dave, Gladys called. Karen might have some ideas about the bridge placement. Dave looked up, surprised. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. We could use another perspective. We're debating whether to include a handrail. To Karen's shock, he actually seemed interested in her opinion. She found herself engaged in a civil discussion about safety standards and aesthetic considerations. When she mentioned that a handrail might be useful for elderly residents during winter conditions, several people nodded appreciatively. Walking home later, Karen felt strange, lighter somehow. For years, she believed her value to the community came from enforcing rules, from maintaining standards through fear and consequence. But today, she'd contributed without issuing a single threat, and people had listened. That night, she pulled out her journal of violations and stared at the pages of meticulously documented infractions. After a long moment, she closed it and instead opened her laptop to research bridge designs. "What are you working on?" Richard asked, bringing her a cup of tea. "Something new," Karen replied, and for the first time in months, she smiled.